yes, we've had some introduction of biological threats. These biological threats are things like mankind now living so close together. Have you noticed that now when we have climatic risks, that it affects a lot more people? And the reason for that is there are just so many more people. People are living on the coast.
Together.
People are living in areas where we realised there was volcanic activity. So people desisted from living there for a very long time, but have decided to move back there.
Yep.
Anyway, so these are biological risks.
We're back in a Gunners Club for another exciting one.
And that means you're here with us. You're here with Gunnar, of course with Zeus. Thank you for being with us. Now, fasten your seatbelts because the end of the world is nigh.
Very topical at the moment. Very topical indeed.
We're talking, of course, about the Doomsday Clock. Now, who can forget the revelations according to John, book 66 of your Bible, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Pestilence, war, famine, and death. 4 things that can bring about really the catastrophe, the end of civilization or humanity.
Well, we're being told, and if you read all the newspapers and watch all the television news, we're only minutes, almost seconds away from total annihilation.
Isn't it interesting? The idea of a doomsday clock really started in 1947. You can imagine at that time, it was that epoch where you'd had the nuclear conflagration in Japan, right. Launching of 2 nuclear bombs. And then suddenly people realised if this technology is in the hands of more than just one power, well, really the reality is that mankind could be facing its oblivion. And since then, of course, nuclear technology has been stolen, sold, transferred. Spies have taken that technology. It's now in many hands. And so the nuclear clock, the doomsday clock, I should say, keeps changing. In fact, between 1947 and now, the doomsday clock has actually moved some 25 times. Thank God, not always closer to midnight. Sometimes it's actually gone back quite a bit. For example, after the Cold War with the USSR and with America and with the non-proliferation treaty being signed, it actually moved back by about 7 minutes.
Is that right? That I didn't know.
Thank God for mankind. But I remember as a young boy studying for my leaving exam, what we called VCE or HSC.
Yeah.
There was a song by Midnight Oil that went, I look at the clock on the wall, it says 3 minutes to midnight. And at that stage, around 1984 or so, the clock stood at about 3 minutes to midnight. Now, there's many things that could bring on the apocalypse of mankind, the end of civilization. I wonder if you think there's been a civilization, in fact, before this. But here we go. Have a think about these things. Obviously, the nuclear proliferation and nuclear strikes in the Second World War were the cause of the creation of the Doomsday Clock in 1947.
The early 20th century saw the outbreak of some of the deadliest conflicts in history. World wars between global powers that left unimaginable suffering in their wake. Despite this, the period from the end of World War II to the present has been called the Long Peace, a somewhat ironic moniker given what it took to achieve that peace. For nuclear scientists and physicists in the early 20th century, years of theorizing and research culminated on July 16, 1945 in the Trinity test, when scientists from the Manhattan Project detonated the world's first nuclear device in New Mexico. That moment has been called the dawn of the atomic age.
Okay, so think about pestilence.
COVID, perhaps?
Yeah, what if we recently have that can give an example of that? Now, China and Europe suffered greatly with the Black Plague, but other continents didn't suffer it so much. But genetically, the Europeans and the Chinese really experienced it, lived through it, and if you're living in a European body or an Asian body, you've got markers in your body as a result of that pestilence that actually happened. The idea of a virus that could be created in Wuhan and could be transferred immediately around the world gives us pause to think about what pestilence or disease actually is. Famine. Now, if you've lived let's say in other continents that were unaffected by that, famine was a reality, even until very recent times. Remember, do they know it's Christmas time? That was a reaction against famine in Africa. It's still something which is very common today. And death, well, that can really be whatever you want it to be. But think about today. What's actually moving the Doomsday Clock forward? As of today, we are 89 seconds shy of midnight. Now, it's hard to really understand or make sense of the Doomsday Clock because, well, for a start, I grew up with an analog clock and now it's digital. I'm sure somehow that makes a difference.
Engineers created the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, an organization meant to warn and educate the public about the potential harm of their creation. The public's imagination during the post-war period would be filled with visions of nuclear-powered transportation and endless supplies of energy.
A giant of limitless power at man's command.
But the inventors of the technology behind the atomic bomb were more concerned about the prospect of an arms race and worldwide nuclear war.
There is no denying that since that moment, the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives.
Over its more than 75-year history, the Bulletin has monitored existential threats to humanity and communicated insights to the public through its magazine, its website, its events, and the Doomsday Clock, which visualizes humanity's metaphorical proximity to global catastrophe. Martil Langsdorff, an artist married to a Manhattan Project engineer, created the Doomsday Clock in 1947 as the first cover image for the Bulletin's magazine. It was initially set at 7 minutes to midnight. The clock first moved in 1949 when Bulletin editor Eugene Rabinowitch decided to move the minute hand forward to 3 minutes to midnight in response to the Soviet Union testing its first nuclear weapon, years ahead of when many in the US government thought possible. In all, the clock has moved 25 times, first as dictated by Rabinowitch and later as set by the Bulletin's Science and Security Board.
But if we can say that if the clock is close enough to midnight at all, a nuclear strike surely would mean that there's the end of mankind, whether it's actually 15 minutes off midnight or whether it's 89 seconds off midnight. But the modern things which have changed are this. Yes, we've had some introduction of biological threats. These biological threats are things like mankind now living so close together. Have you noticed that now when we have climatic risks, that it affects a lot more people? And the reason for that is there are just so many more people. People are living on the coast.
Together.
People are living in areas where we realised there was volcanic activity. So people desisted from living there for a very long time, but have decided to move back there.
Yep.
Anyway, so these are biological risks. If we have a look at things like climate change. Now, how immediate climate change is, climate does change. It changes whether it's dependent or independent of CO2 activities. There are changes in the heat of the sun. There are changes in the distance of the Earth from the sun. There are differences in climate which are reflected, for example, in European architecture, which shows the difference of heat in time in the periods which the buildings were built.
Exactly
Have a look
right.
at things like preponderance of windows, and I'm not talking about when the window tax was in effect, the size of windows, things like that. You realise that climate was not always stable. Have a look at the differences of the ice ages and how it opened up vast tracts of geography, particularly for Europeans to come across from Asia Minor to come across. These things are just fact. But the world we're living in today is very different, isn't it? For example, AI is something which now, when I do a Microsoft Word document, I'll write a letter, for example, or I'll prepare for a podcast and I can use something like Copilot or ChatGPT and actually get some further ideas, something to reinforce what it is I'm looking at or to remember what it is it's reinforcing. Remember the movie War Games back in 1984?
Oh, what a great classic sci-fi movie that was.
And we did a fantastic video on that on nuclear war, if you want to go back, where effectively what they wanted to do was to stop the launching of nuclear weapons, and they turned the chairs where the controlsmen were sitting only to find there were consoles there instead of people. So when we're talking about AI, to a large extent what we're talking about is replacing the safety command or the control of a human and putting it into an automated process instead. So remember, when the algorithm is basically this. we've got a mathematical operation which will determine a response. And a response could be, for example, yes, no, or hold.
Yeah.
Seek advice. That's what an algorithm essentially is. Unfortunately for you, it'll be something that directs you to buy your next product from Amazon or something like that.
That's right, yeah.
But you can imagine when we're looking at the Doomsday Clock, we're saying there's an algorithm or there's a different control. It's an AI control that's actually automating what the response will be for humanity. Now, there's been a number of very, very recent events that have moved us. Remember, we've had 25 movements since 1947 to the
Closer
very
to midnight.
closest we've ever been at 89 seconds.
But I mean, look, you only have to look at the news to understand that, you know, there's...
Last year, the Doomsday Clock was moved for the 25th time to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. Citing the conflict in Ukraine, not only as a potential point of nuclear escalation, but the war's effects in undermining global efforts to combat climate change, disinformation, and the alarm it raised about biological and chemical warfare. The bulletin urged action from the world's leaders on the multitude of threats facing the planet. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said last year, the Doomsday Clock is a global alarm clock. Have leaders acted with urgency? The bulletin has been watching. Again, our Science and Security Board met and asked two important questions. Is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to last year? And is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to the more than 75 years we have been asking the question? In 2023, trends continue to point ominously towards global catastrophe. The war in Ukraine poses an ever-present risk of nuclear escalation, and the October 7 attack in Israel and war in Gaza provides further illustration of the horrors of modern war, even without nuclear escalation.
The Russia-Ukraine war, where there's a possibility that someone is going to escalate, somebody is going to make a mistake, someone's going to make a miscalculation, and you don't know from which side, or both sides.
Well, it won't be on Ukraine's side for the simple fact that they signed an agreement where they were promised that they wouldn't be threatened by Russia, and Russia in turn took all of the nuclear weapons that were held on their land. But Russia has actually done some saber rattling, basically saying, although not obviously saying, that nuclear weapons might be used in that conflict. And that's a really good example, Seuss. That's one of the reasons we're at the closest we've ever been.
But there's the other one.
There's Hamas and Israel.
Well, there's Hamas and Israel.
I'm telling you, that's also one of the considered reasons why we are now at 89 seconds from midnight.
Well, Hamas, Israel, and of course the counter of that is Iran, who are getting very close to being yet another competitor in that field.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the elephant in the room, China and America.
Or China and India.
Well, it just goes on, doesn't it?
You see, the more that I read, the more that I study, the more I talk to people, and the more conflicts that I have in my life, and that's the industry that unfortunately I work in. Communication is the number one thing. It's a reason why human beings exist and that we have the large heads and brains that we have today. People matter to us, we matter to other people. And most fights really aren't fought over resources. There's usually enough resources to go along. It's the ideologies and the barriers that we set amongst each other. And then in turn, if we think of ourselves as being different, it's the barriers that we erect, and it's then the threats that we make against the other people to make sure that we're kept separate. And in fact, then we'll be able to propagate the ideals that we have, the symbology that we have, and the recognition of who we are. You know, the Greeks many years ago would have this idea of ondos, or existence, and today we talk about, ontology. This is our idea of who we are. You know, when you talk with other people, the one fission or fracture that you'll never be able to overcome is something which threatens the idea that another person has as to who they are.
Yeah.
It's more important than anything else at all, and it's sort of a priceless sort of thing to keep in mind. But the Doomsday Clock, the one issue I really have with it is that whether we're at a couple of seconds from midnight or we're at an hour from midnight, the weapons now exist where in fact we could actually exterminate mankind in one go.
Yep.
Realistically, I don't think that climate change is something which could do it to the same impact, in that there are so many human beings alive today that if we're looking at a true catastrophe, and look, it really just comes from the Greek word to destroy, it would not be possible to destroy all of mankind.
It would be
something like that.
It would be something like an asteroid strike. That would be something that would do that, as in the totality of mankind.
Yeah.
But nuclear war may not destroy humanity in totality instantly, but it definitely has the possibility of destroying mankind over time from the after effects of that said nuclear war.
I agree with that. So really, what is the resolution? If the Doomsday Clock has a purpose, it's to show us, essentially going back to that old adage of ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. The death of one is the death of yourself as well. And everything is an existential question. This is an existential problem. It actually belies our own existence as humanity. What are we trying to answer? We're trying to answer this one problem. Communication at the moment between world powers is at the lowest point that it's been for some time. I'm saying this because in the last 2 days we've had the saber rattling regarding tariffs, and with Xi Jinping saying that any sort of war or conflict that America is prepared to up, China is up for as well. Now essentially that's a veiled threat to say that they're up for a worldwide conflagration as well that would destroy all of mankind. I don't think this sort of talk is a civilized form of talk. I'm saying this for this reason. It has to do with the existence of all of mankind. If we're looking at people who pride themselves upon their culture, upon their history, upon their emerging power in this world today, then I'd say the only way you can convey that humanity and that power is by actually getting in a room where you can have a proper discourse with people and you can impart your wisdom and together come up with a resolution for things going forward. I don't believe economically that things like tariffs are a good economic solution to anything. I think it's not a balm at all. I understand that that's something which Trump uses as a knee-jerk reaction so that effectively he can be in a better bargaining position going forward for any trade that he wants to do. I don't see it as something which actually advances the common goal. Economically, I have a lot of problems with it as well. For a start, a lot of the production which America does relies on Chinese parts. You put a 20% tariff on that. Effectively, anything even made in America with those parts is going to be to a large part more expensive as well and will disadvantage. The structure of the world economy doesn't work that way. And the structure of the world economy is all important because the structure of the world economy is a completely integrated piece. It means that all continents, all countries, all economic systems and all political systems, including the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea, are completely integrated with other ones, whether they like it or not. You can build a wall, but economically and societally, you cannot fully do that, and you'll never be insulated completely by doing that. If you want to make a change, it has to be a change which actually works eventually for the benefit of all kingdoms. Remember when China didn't do that during the Opium Wars? It actually resulted in England, exporting drugs, essentially, to China, which sort of is the pretext that Trump has now for putting the tariffs on China, saying that there's been a fentanyl crisis upon the US. So you see, this is not a win solution. We've already played through this scenario before with the Opium Wars and with Hong Kong, and eventually Hong Kong became a Chinese territory, became part of the British Empire. We've played through this before. What is the end goal that we want now? Do we want to look at the clock on the wall? Remember Midnight Oil saying it says 3 minutes to midnight? Or do we actually want to say we are now all civilized people and we recognize each other, most importantly, as civilized people?
But are we?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And that is the beauty of mankind. That's the reason why we've transcended our environment and with writing and technology, our time, and the reason why we will find ourselves at peace and one people. But we've got to work on more than just knee-jerk reactions. I look at the clock on the wall and it says 89 seconds to midnight.
There is one other thing that we haven't covered. What if AI gains sentience and decides, in its wisdom, that we are no longer necessary?
In part, it probably doesn't matter whether it gains sentience or not. What actually matters is that it is put in an entrusted position with power to actually do what it's programmed to do. For example, I said that example in the film War Games, where they turned the chairs, and instead of there being a human to make a decision or to halt the war, there was actually a console to do the very same thing. If the decisions are automated, and with all of the faith that we're now putting into algorithms, that could happen. Now, when I studied statistics, we were playing with things like genetic algorithms. That means that the algorithm would actually have permutations in itself. Every iteration of the algorithm in itself would change. It was a genetic algorithm. It's kind of scary to think about. So even under the command of humans, whether it's self-reflecting or not, which is what we define as sentience, it would still be able to adapt and to change. And if it's put in that position of control, we suffer the consequences, and the world is simply ashes in our mouths. If you like what you see, what can they do?
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll keep bringing it to you.
We look forward to your company again. We'll see you soon.
Bye.